Human teeth make a surprisingly good money. They're compact, portable, and it's not that hard to tell the difference between the good ones and bad, real ones and fake. And yet no one thinks we should use teeth as money, and it's not hard to see why. Imagine the grave robberies. Imagine the mouth robberies. Reflection on cases like this uncovers an important question in the philosophy of money, which is not whether something is apt for use as money or useful as money, but rather whether it is good to use it as money. Good for us, good for our world. I want to think today about an important question along these lines with respect to a new kind of money. And I'll be doing so using some of the arguments, evidence, and discoveries or findings of a recent academic book on the topic, Resistance Money, a Philosophical Case for Bitcoin. The big question of the book, and that I'll think with you today about, is whether Bitcoin is good when used as money. Good for us, good for the world. This is a big question, and thinking through it will require that we attend to all sorts of different perspectives. Here I'll just give a sampling of some of the arguments and evidence discussed in that book. We'll begin with an introduction to Bitcoin, what it is, what it does. Then we'll think about a thought experiment that allows us to strip away some of our biases when assessing Bitcoin. And in the remaining sections of the talk, we'll think about Bitcoin's monetary policies and institutions, its privacy features or lack thereof, its capacity for censorship resistance and monetary inclusion, and finally, we'll turn to its security model and the energy it deploys. Welcome to Bitcoin. We'll begin with Judith Milhon. She was a member of the hippie movement and the do-it-yourself movement in the 70s, which relied not on institutions, but on individuals working together to solve problems. Judith was also a civil rights protester and occasionally jailed for her work in that capacity. But her life changed in the 80s when she first encountered computers. She was a hacker, and her slogan quickly became, "Girls need modems." Now Judith, or St. Jude as she was later known, coined a term for her group of friends who were involved with a movement. They called themselves the cypherpunks, a play on the word cyberpunk. And they foresaw the rise of the internet and its importance in human society, but they saw a threat there as well, potential for surveillance, for control, for abuse. And their goal was to use cryptography to stave off that potential abuse and turn the internet into an engine of freedom rather than authoritarian nightmares. The holy grail for the cypherpunks wasn't to create digital money. Digital money has existed for a long time. It predated the cypherpunks and is with us still, but rather to create digital cash, which in software terms would be peer-to-peer money. But a problem plagued everyone who ever tried to create digital cash, which is how to prevent double spending the same quantity of money twice over. After all, with digital items, you can copy them for free. So how do we prevent the copy-pasting of money? Well, Bitcoin was the first workable solution to this problem that didn't use trusted parties. Instead of relying on a commercial or a central bank to audit a ledger and verify transactions as valid or invalid, and to make sure that no one double spent, Bitcoin used a very different kind of design that eliminated 3 different kinds of trusted parties. First, it did without makers. Makers are trusted parties relied on to produce financial assets or monies. So in traditional monies, this would include things like commercial or central banks. Bitcoin has no commercial bank and no central bank managing the production of new currency. The network as a whole does that. Bitcoin also forgoes managers. Now, with other digital assets and digital monies, you cannot hold them yourself. Instead, you have to rely on a trusted custodian to hold them for you. Think about a PayPal balance. You can't keep that yourself. Instead, PayPal holds your balance for you. Not so with Bitcoin. With Bitcoin, you can hold the money yourself. And finally, Bitcoin does away with mediators. Think again about the PayPal balance. How can you transfer that to someone else? Only with the cooperation of a trusted third party, maybe several, banks and PayPal itself. With Bitcoin, none of this is true. It might be helpful to contrast Bitcoin here with traditional currencies in both physical and digital form. Notice that with physical dollars, that is, cash, you can, in fact, manage the money yourself, and you can transfer it without the use of trusted mediators or third parties. You simply hand it over to someone, and no one else needs to know or give permission for that transaction to take place. Cash does involve trusted makers, of course. This would be, for example, the US Mint that produces new physical cash. Digital dollars involve trusted third parties of all three kinds: makers, managers, and mediators. Someone to make the money, someone to take custody of it for its users, and someone to oversee and serve as a middleman in all transactions. Bitcoin, in contrast to these traditional monies, does away with all three kinds of trusted parties. And Bitcoin here stands in sharp contrast not just to traditional monies, but also to other cryptocurrencies. Let's take a look at how those currencies have been produced to see what this might mean. Here are charts showing how tokens were initially distributed for the top three non-Bitcoin, non-dollar denominated cryptocurrencies. And you can see it's some combination of sales with proceeds going to the developers, gifts to foundations, gifts to insiders, and gifts to community members. Now here's what I see when I look at this chart. I see insiders. Proceeds going to insiders. Foundations run by insiders, community groups run by insiders, and of course insiders who are themselves insiders. It's just more trusted makers, as we've already seen in traditional currencies. Bitcoin, by contrast, doesn't involve tokens produced by a foundation or a firm or a business or a commercial bank or a central bank. Instead, there is one and only one way to produce new Bitcoin, which is to win in the process of competitive mining, an open process in which anyone may participate. So Bitcoin stands apart, not just from traditional monies, but also from other cryptocurrencies. It's trust-reduced digital money. But is it good? That's our big question. To help us approach this question in an unbiased way, we'll introduce a thought experiment. And notice that biases are present here. They're political biases where Bitcoin gets labeled as being on the left or on the right, and we align into our political tribes accordingly. There are financial biases where some people have a strong interest in Bitcoin either rising in value or falling in value if they're either long or short Bitcoin. And the reputational biases at stake here as well. Imagine all the journalists and reporters and financial pundits who for years predicted either wild appreciation for Bitcoin or that Bitcoin will shortly die. Each of those kinds of parties has their reputation at stake and a strong interest in seeing Bitcoin either succeed or die. How do we see through this cloud of biases? Here's a thought experiment we find useful. Imagine that you will fall asleep, and when you wake up, you will be someone, but you don't know who it will be. Now ask this question. If you didn't know who you'd be, a Venezuelan farmer, an American CEO, a hardworking software engineer in Afghanistan, or someone else besides, if you didn't know who you'd be, would you want Bitcoin to exist? Would you want to wake up to a world with Bitcoin or without? Bitcoin is complicated, and responsible evaluation of it requires that we approach it from many different angles. We'll look at just a few in the minutes that follow. Let's begin with Bitcoin's monetary policies and institutions by thinking about the problem of monetary luck, which is just this question. Will I be born under a well-managed monetary regime or not? When I wake up, will I have good money available to me or bad? What kind of monies will I have access to? There are really two aspects to this question. There's both monetary policies and institutions. Policies are the policies that govern the issuance or supply of money. Think here of things like interest rates, reserve ratios, quantitative easing, and tightening. The levers that central bankers and commercial bankers pull to expand or contract the supply of money. And monetary institutions are just the rules and institutions and structures that govern those policies and that select what those policies will be and who gets to choose. Now, these can both go very bad, and one sign that they've gone bad is rampant inflation. Now, as it turns out, this is a real problem. Indeed, there are at least 69 economies with confirmed double-digit inflation representing more than 2.1 billion people, according to the United Nations. What this means is that you have a 1/4 chance when you wake up, not knowing who you'd be, of being someone who suffers from this kind of wild inflation. And it's not, in fact, all that uncommon for monies like these to fail in catastrophic ways. Here's some examples from just the first half of 2024. Imagine that you lived in Ethiopia and that the value of your money dropped by 94% in just half a year. That sucks. And it's not just bad for users, although it can be catastrophic for them. Wild inflation of this kind is also socially destabilizing. And this is something that even John Maynard Keynes knew. When thinking about good monies and bad, it's useful to look closer at an important trade-off that trusted makers work around when managing money, which is between a price guarantee and a quantity guarantee. A price guarantee is a guarantee that some unit of currency will be worth tomorrow more or less what it's worth today. Stability and purchasing power, in other words. And to achieve this, traditional currencies do away with any quantity guarantee. And central and commercial banks instead attempt to manipulate quantity so as to achieve steady purchasing power. So this is the trade-off of decent monies. They enable a price guarantee at the expense of a quantity guarantee. There are some uncertainties about the future of the money, and in exchange for that uncertainty, they promise, and when things go well, give you certainty with respect to purchasing power. Now, bad monies have neither of these guarantees. You don't know what it'll be worth tomorrow, and it could be worth nothing, and you don't know how many units of currency there will be. It might be hyperinflated and diluted into nothingness. Now, some people, and this is just the problem of monetary luck, are stuck with bad money only. It's not as though they can choose to use the Swiss franc or the American dollar because their local institutions might even block access to such good monies. Bitcoin is a money machine that does away with central bankers manipulating quantity and offers instead a distinctive package of monetary policies and institutions. Bitcoin's central monetary policy is a deterministic supply schedule that releases new Bitcoin with each new block that's produced in its blockchain, and that approaches a supply cap of 21 million, beyond which no new Bitcoins can be created. Bitcoin's monetary institutions are the users themselves who enforce the rules of the network and that deterministic supply schedule. The equilibrium outcome is that there are no changes that are viable to Bitcoin's monetary policies because users need to coordinate with each other, which means sticking with the rules that everyone else is already sticking with, resulting in a kind of stasis. Bitcoin offers a rock-solid quantity guarantee and forgoes any price guarantee. The trade-off here, or the consequence, is volatility, especially in the short run. And the volatility here outstrips anything we see in decent monies with responsible central banks successfully enacting a price guarantee. Now, some have the wherewithal and the wealth and the fortitude to outlast that volatility, and they tend to do all right. But for those who don't have those privileges, this is a difficult money to use because it fluctuates in its purchasing power every hour, every day, every week. And yet, nonetheless, Bitcoin is an important exit option for those who only have access to bad monies. It adds a third column to this chart, a different kind of trade-off than those made by either bad monies or decent monies. Bitcoin offers its users on an opt-in basis money that, though it has no price guarantee, has a rock-solid and verifiable quantity guarantee. And for many, this will be a trade-off worth accepting. Here's another way to think about things. In other contexts, we often value stable rules, even if they're not optimal. We call this the rule of law. These are rules that are transparent, anyone can see what they are, that are general, that don't have insiders but instead apply to everyone with full generality, and that are predictable. We know what the rules are and we know what their consequences are. Now, Bitcoin implements what we might call monetary rule of law. Its monetary policies and institutions are transparent. Anyone can see what they are. They're general. There are no insiders. There are no special parties who have unique powers to produce or manipulate money. And they're predictable. Indeed, algorithmically predictable. And of course, there's a trade-off here. Bitcoin offers no price guarantee. So return now to that position, not knowing who you'd be when you wake up, and ask this question. Would I want to have that kind of exit option available to me? An exit option that makes this trade-off? Especially if I was one of the 1 in 4 people who didn't have access to good money. Let's think now about privacy, what it is, why it matters, and what Bitcoin means for financial privacy. Privacy is not secrecy, it's not anonymity. Instead, it's a kind of power. It's the power to selectively disclose yourself to the world, to choose what kinds of information about yourself is released into the wild, and how. Financial privacy is often overlooked in broader discussions of privacy, but this is a mistake, because financial privacy matters just as much or even more than other kinds of privacy. And to see why, just notice what your money and what you do with it says about who you are. Think about someone who's recently been buying diapers, or medical care, or political tracts, or religious paraphernalia, or drug paraphernalia. These purchases say what you've been up to, where you've been, perhaps who your friends are, and perhaps most importantly of all, they say what you value. They say what's actually going on in your heart by revealing what you're willing to give up money or something of value to receive. Financial privacy matters. Bitcoin's ledger of transactions is fully transparent and public. Anyone can look at it to determine where a transaction came from, its amount, and where it's going to. Now, of course, the ledger itself doesn't include personal identifying information like names or addresses, but it does include cryptographic addresses. And these can unfortunately be correlated with real-world identities by those who monitor the blockchain. So to use Bitcoin in a private way, to preserve financial privacy while using Bitcoin, one must turn to specialized privacy tools. One privacy tool is called CoinJoin, which allows users to smear their transactions together in a way that obscures their origins or their destinations. This can make it harder for someone monitoring the public ledger to tell where money came from or where it's going. Another privacy tool is one of Bitcoin's Layer 2 networks, the Lightning Network, which allows nodes to transfer value from node to node to node in a way such that their final destination of a transaction doesn't necessarily know which node earlier on in the network it came from. Another useful upgrade for privacy for users that need it. Now, these tools are complicated and difficult to use well, but in the best of cases, they can sometimes offer their users something like cash-like levels of privacy. Is that actually good for the world, though? Well, we think cash is good for the world. It's good to have a world where people can hold physical currency and transfer it between themselves without the cooperation or knowledge of some trusted third party. And so we think that the existence of a digital cash-like instrument is also good for the world. And so we formulate this question. If you didn't know who you'd be, would you want digital cash? We think so, and so we think this counts in Bitcoin's favor. We turn now to financial censorship and exclusion. And we will argue that Bitcoin enables the actual use of certain vital rights and freedoms. Our argument unfolds in this way. The first premise is that basic freedoms require transactional freedom. Basic freedoms include freedom of speech, of assembly, of press, of religion. And notice that to actually make good on these freedoms, we often need to spend money, to build religious buildings and purchase paraphernalia, to travel so that we can assemble together in protest, to distribute materials that encode our ideas, books and pamphlets, and so on. So actually making good on these core freedoms often requires the use of money, freedom to transact, in other words. Now, in this digital age, we argue furthermore that transactional freedom requires not just money, but digital cash. Censorship in the realm of transactions often works the same way it does in the realm of information, which is this: trusted third parties shut down or exclude or control those whose ideas or whose transactions they don't wish to see happen. Bitcoin, of course, does away with these trusted third parties, the trusted custodians or intermediaries in a transaction. Now, why would we want this? Why would we want to get rid of trusted parties who have this capacity to censor or exclude? Well, when you're waking up and you don't know who you'd be, you are rolling the dice. You have a 1 in 2 chance of waking up under an authoritarian regime, without democratic institutions, and without assurance of basic freedoms. Would you want to have the ability or the access to a money that could bypass those local authorities? If so, you might want Bitcoin. Another 1/6 of the world's population is unbanked, and many of those that are unbanked because they are excluded by local institutions for a variety of reasons. So you have a 1 in 6 chance of being one of those people. Would you want there to be an option for you? A kind of money from which it is very difficult to be excluded? Well, that's Bitcoin. Bitcoin is digital money without trusted parties. And in that way, it's like digital cash. So we conclude on the basis of these premises that basic freedoms require digital cash. And because basic freedoms are good, so too this counts in Bitcoin's favor because it offers the world this kind of disintermediated digital cash. There are trade-offs here. Introducing digital cash to the world creates good as well as bad. Some of the harms it enables include money laundering, sanctions evasion, and ransomware. In the book, we take a closer look at the empirical evidence around these phenomena and show that the harms are outweighed by the benefits. And so we return to our big question. If you didn't know who you'd be, would you want there to be money that others can't easily control? Because of the high odds of being a person under authoritarian rule or being excluded from digital banking, we think the answer is yes. There are lots of objections to Bitcoin. In the book, we consider, develop, and respond to about 25 of them. I'm not going to do that here, but I will share some of our thoughts about one of the most important objections, which looks at Bitcoin's security model and its use of energy. The basic objection here is that Bitcoin mining uses too much energy for no good reason, and that the result is an environmental disaster. Now, this objection has taken many forms over the years, and you might have seen some of these even in the popular press. For example, there's this famous article from Newsweek in 2017 predicting that Bitcoin mining would consume all the world's energy by 2020. Well, that didn't actually happen, and many other breathless predictions from critics have simply failed to come true on this count. So here's what we think is the sober truth. Bitcoin users, like other users of energy, pay for the network's energy use, and this actually serves a useful purpose. Here are 3 threats to monetary security. There's false spending, when someone can spend money that's not theirs. There's counterfeiting, when they create fake money. And there's double spending, when they spend a balance twice over. Now, traditional monetary networks spend a lot of time, money, and attention on the first 2 kinds of threats. There are cybersecurity experts and audits to make sure that there's no false spending and no counterfeiting. And commercial and central banks and financial institutions all cooperate together at great cost to prevent those kinds of attacks from occurring. Now, Bitcoin is quite different. In fact, it uses pretty trivial and cheap cryptography to block false spending or counterfeiting. Just simple cryptography and digital signatures ensures that those things are not a real threat to Bitcoin's security model. So instead of concentrating its resources there, Bitcoin's resources are concentrated, or the resources of its users are concentrated towards preventing false spending. And this is done through the process of mining. So predictions about Bitcoin's energy use have been wildly overblown, and Bitcoin users themselves pay for that energy, just like any other user of energy does. But this observation alone does not diffuse the objection, for there's still the question of externalities, negative spillover effects that have consequences not just for users, but everyone. And notice that these loom especially large when reasoning behind the veil, that is, not knowing who you'd be when you wake up. Because no matter who you are, you might pay some of the costs associated with, for example, carbon emissions, which affect everyone alive. At the heart of the environmental and carbon emissions-based case against Bitcoin, we find one very important and widely cited scientific paper, published in Nature Climate Change in 2018. The paper predicts that Bitcoin emissions alone could push global warming above 2 degrees Celsius. Now, if you know anything about climate science, you know that this is a wild prediction, and if true, quite alarming. The paper is based on a model which says, over time, what the carbon emissions associated with Bitcoin mining will look like. And here's the main chart from that paper. It predicts that by 2020, cumulative emissions associated with mining will be something like 500 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. This is an astounding prediction. And then the chart goes up from there. It doesn't start at 500. No wonder their conclusions were astounding as well. Now, 2020 was some time ago, and we have more empirical evidence to look at. The best evidence we have here from a neutral and reliable source probably comes from the Cambridge Electricity Index. And here's what they say. They say that cumulative emissions associated with Bitcoin mining are real, and they're somewhere between 200 and 320 megatons of CO2 equivalent. Notice the difference in units here, mega versus giga. This is a difference of 1,000-fold. What this means is that the most widely relied upon model in predicting Bitcoin's environmental consequences has been wildly empirically refuted in the years since it's been published. And yet, curiously, it continues to be cited and relied on as an actual source of good science. The truth is simply that it isn't. This is bad science that's been empirically refuted. Now again, emissions from Bitcoin mining are real, perhaps 60 to 80 megatons per year of CO2 equivalent. And this is an actual negative externality to be taken into account when evaluating Bitcoin's overall effects on the world. We can see in a slightly different way some of the same data. The carbon emissions associated with Bitcoin mining are real, and they are cumulative, and they are a cost to be taken into account when evaluating Bitcoin. Here's a tempting but fallacious inference. If you deleted Bitcoin from the world, then you would delete those carbon emissions associated with Bitcoin mining. To see why the inference is incorrect, it's useful to distinguish rival and non-rival uses of energy. Rival use of energy by Bitcoin miners is when they're bidding against others for the same energy. And notice that if we remove the Bitcoin miners from the situation, there's still someone else who's going to be buying and using that energy. So the carbon emissions associated will still result, even if you remove Bitcoin from the situation. The non-rival uses of energy are interesting. These often involve new energy production far away from the grid. Think here of a Bitcoin mine built atop a new hydro dam. Now, these kinds of non-rival uses of energy turn out to often be less carbon intensive, like that hydro dam example. So even if you deleted them from the world by deleting Bitcoin from the world, you wouldn't be deleting a significant amount of carbon emissions. Another factor to consider when evaluating Bitcoin's environmental consequences is that an increasing portion of its mining network uses captured methane, which turns methane, a greenhouse gas that's 60 to 80 times worse than carbon dioxide, into carbon dioxide. And they get paid to do it. So it monetizes this extremely beneficial environmental process of tuning down our methane emissions by turning it into a much less dangerous greenhouse gas. So zooming out, we ask again this question. If you didn't know who you'd be, would you want, as an option in your world, a money like this? A money that got security through energy? Now, we haven't made a complete case for Bitcoin here. There are more pros to be considered and more cons as well. Lots of both, in fact. But here's what we think readers should do. Make your own scorecard. Line up the pros and cons together and then weight them based on how important they'd be to you if you were deciding how you'd want a world to be if you didn't know your place within that world. And so our gift to you is this question. If you didn't know who you'd be, how would you feel about Bitcoin? If you want to think more about that question in the light of relevant empirical research and a comprehensive framework, well, here's our other gift to you. It's a book. Let us know what you think. Cheers.